Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Joining us today on Uncommon Knowledge, Christopher Hitchens, author of the best-selling book, God is Not Great, talking today about Iraq. Two texts for us today, Christopher. One is an interview that John Burns, foreign correspondent for the New York Times, gave July 27th to Hugh Hewitt radio show host. And then I will give you a few comments, a few excerpts as well from President Bush's speech August 22nd to the veterans of foreign wars. Question, is the surge working? John Burns, quote, "There's no doubt that those 30,000 extra American troops are making a difference. In Baghdad, fewer car bombs, fewer bombs in general, quite remarkably lower levels of civilian casualties. There's no doubt that al-Qaeda has taken a beating," close quote. You concur? As far as you know, the surge is working?
I'm an extraordinarily strong admirer of John Burns and a slight friend of his, I'm proud to say. And I think he's one of the people who makes one proud to be in the same profession. And his reporting from Iraq, as from many other countries, has been exemplary and courageous. But I think there's a distinct problem here. Those who support the surge feel obliged to say that it's going well, when you don't have to believe it's going well to support it. I mean, the mass murder, for example, of the Yazidi minority on the Syrian border by al-Qaeda-ist opportunists, that's just in the last few days, a sudden new horror show we hadn't even imagined would happen before, doesn't really support his view that there are fewer bombs. There is evidence, there was before the surge, by the way, that in Ramadi province in particular.
Ramadi is in the south. I'm sorry.
Wait. Now, I may have to...
Anbar and Ramadi, I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's at the Al-Anbar province.
Anbar, all right.
I'd better say, because I'm better qualified to pronounce it, have had more emails from there recently.
All right.
That in any case, al-Qaeda had taken a terrific pasting, and that the evidence was that even quite extreme Sunni nationalists, sectarians, had turned against the bin Ladenists. That's the very important thing. There are several wars going on in Iraq at the moment, and there are two that we cannot afford to lose. One is the one that denies a victory to al-Qaeda in any town or province, however obscure. And the other is the one that guarantees that the gains made by the secular, autonomous, democratic Kurdish people not be undermined.
Now, hang on.
That those be made permanent. No, given those two things, which I wish the President would say more about,
right.
Then yes, but the point of this is this must be supported whether it's going well or not. It is a huge mistake of those who support the intervention in Iraq to consider that it must be going well in order to deserve support. It's precisely when it's going badly that it needs support.
I understand the point. I want to take a parenthesis, at least I had, because I hadn't, you've raised a point that was not to me an issue. Are the Kurdish gains under threat? I had thought that the Kurds were home and away, that they established an independent Kurdistan, that they've got their borders under control, that there's some threat from the Turks, but we can put counter pressure on the Turks, that was working.
I think we can probably guarantee them against the Turks. But and in the meantime, the Sunni-Shia gang warfare in the south and center of the country may be enough to keep those militias busy, but there are permanently attempts to nibble away at the frontiers of Kurdistan. There have been, not many, but some car bombs exploded there. One of them killed several friends of mine, and there's a permanent strategy of tension from the theocratic extremists in the city of Kirkuk, which the Kurds hope, by democratic referendum, to have counted as part of their territory, which would give them the control of the oil field that will supply the necessary economic material basis for an autonomous region.
Kirkuk is the Kurds' play for oil.
Yes, it's also it's the most important disputed city in Iraq, and in my opinion, it properly deserves to be regarded as part of the Kurdish autonomous region.
All right. So the surge does not need to be working to deserve support. It must be supported whether it's working, whether it's going well at any given time or badly. It must be supported. Nevertheless, in Baghdad, is it your impression that it's working, that the levels of violence are considerably lower?
No, I can't say it is my impression.
You can't say that.
I can't say that that's in my impression that that's a lasting fact. No.
I see. All right.
And I think the reserve strength of the forces of reaction in Iraq is terrifyingly great. and after they don't have to exert very much influence, for instance, to blow up a power line and that will plunge the whole area of the city into darkness. It only takes a few people and a short amount of explosive to do that. Or to attack a girls' school and make everyone keep their children home from school for the next few weeks. The investment in cruelty and violence by the religious parties needn't be very great to ruin the lives of great swathes and concentric circles of people beyond the forces they can exert. That's what's so terrifying about this.
Now, you mentioned the need to consolidate the gains of the secular democratic government. Question, again, this
in
is...
Kurdistan.
In Kurdistan, I'm
Yes.
sorry. Well, this is a separate question then. Question to Burns. I'm continuing to quote from this interview that John Burns gave. If the surge is working, Mr. Burns, is the Iraqi government making any progress? John Burns, quote, that's probably the most depressing aspect of the entire situation. I think it's fair to say that the Iraqi political leaders are further apart now than they were 6 months ago. Close quote. Now, you can understand why that's not just disappointing, but infuriating. American lives and treasure being expended to give them some kind of breathing space, and they're not taking advantage of it.
No. I went to the scattering of the ashes of a young American who had his life taken from him, actually, by the scum of the earth in Mosul in January, the other day. And, his family could be proud, and were, because he had been very friendly with local Kurds. He'd been talking about making a twin city of his hometown with the city of Dohuk in Kurdistan. Had been very proud to be identified with the American cause in an area where it's regarded as the liberation of the people and so forth, and was perfectly willing to risk his life to do it. And of course the same is true of the Marines in Al-Anbar and elsewhere, who say we're kicking Al-Qaeda's behind, and that's what we're supposed to be doing. To lose your life in a turf war between tribal and sectarian religious partitions in the slums of Baghdad would be a terrible thing. And I think these things deserve to be separated out in the argument, rather than run together as they so often are by both the pro and anti-war forces.
Well, so what is your view of Maliki then? Excuse me, here let me quote President Bush, August 22nd. Quote, Prime Minister Maliki is a good man with a difficult job, and I support him, close quote. Is the president correct to support him?
Prime Minister Maliki is an unpolished thug who's the leader of a terrible clerical party called the Dawa Party, which, among other things, organized a lynching of Saddam Hussein, a man who shouldn't have been executed at all, but should have continued to stand trial, should be on trial still, listening till we've amassed all the record of his crime, in such a way as deliberately to offend, by doing it on the last day of the Eid holiday, the Sunni population of his country. He's a sectarian thug.
A sectarian thug.
I think he should be told, if you want to be head of the Dawa party, that's fine. We can't stop you. You'll be elected to do that. But we're not spending any money to keep a person like you in office.
Really?
Absolutely.
So Bush is making a terrible mistake.
A terrible mistake, yeah. Sectarianism cannot be countenanced. Religious sectarianism is the worst poison that can ever affect a society. We are helping to empower it at the center, even as we are, I will say, helping to defeat it on the periphery. But this is a contradiction that can't go on for very much longer. I don't believe the president understands it for a second.
Democratic leadership in Congress. The question would be whether they understand it any better. John Burns. Last time I'm going to quote John Burns, I think, here. Democratic leadership in Congress, and every Democratic candidate for president without exception wants to get out as quickly as we can. John Burns, quote, a quick early withdrawal of American troops would very likely lead to catastrophic levels of violence there. Do you agree with that?
Yes, that seems self-evident, yes.
Does it seem self-evident? What about the argument that if they had to sort things out by force of arms, they'd get it sorted out, and the Kurds would have Kurdistan, the Sunnis would get backed by Syria, and there would be some kind of region that they would carve out. It would be...
Not by Syria, by Saudi Arabia, I'm afraid.
By Saudi Arabia?
By the most sectarian regional powers would take a hand, the Iranian theocracy and the Saudi one.
It would be brutal. Lots of people would be killed, but they'd settle it out and achieve some kind of stability. Is that simply incorrect?
I think it's absolutely incorrect. It could mean in the long run...
Is it even implausible?
It could mean in the long run that at least what casualties there were would not be, so to say, on our watch. We couldn't avoid responsibility for the immediate surge in death that would undoubtedly be. And I personally cannot imagine a future Iraq composed of only three splinters, a Kurdish, a Sunni, and a Shia one. There's no solidarity of any ethnic or social sort between Sunni and Shia. It's a religious definition only. It's a clerical definition. There are already great rivalries in Basra between different kinds of Shia militia, some of them supported by Iran, some not.
So
not all the Saudis, not all the Sunnis want Wahhabi Sunni gangsterism in their country either. What would happen would be what would have happened, by the way, if we'd never intervened, which would be that Iraq would have been invaded all right and destabilized, but by tribal and sectarian and atomizing forces. There'll be partitions within partitions. The place will
So the
implode.
Peter Galbraith's argument you reject, the notion that the best thing to have done would have been to divvy this thing up into 3 different countries. We have to fight for a unified Iraq. We have to fight for an entity called Iraq, as Iraq is understood, as it was created by the British in the 20s, because there's no choice between that and a kind of endless splintering. Is that your position?
I would support Peter Galbraith, whose work is very admirable and whose book, The End of Iraq, is an extraordinarily good book.
He knows a lot.
Is right about the Kurdish question, but even he says that we'd have to remain in a position where we could strike al-Qaeda forces in Iraq, even if only from over the horizon in Kurdistan, which would mean we couldn't abandon Baghdad altogether to the nearest militiaman. Everyone would live, there would be republics within Iraq the size of a couple of city blocks with their own warlord. I mean, you have to realize how atomizing and how demoralizing, how debauching, how traumatizing the 35 years of Saddam's fascism were. The utter wreckage of any possibility of a political class emerging, for example. All possible rivals destroyed.
So
inculcation of fear of the nearest armed person, people forced to denounce one another, forced to betray one another, reduced really to a Hobbesian state. This is what.
Yugoslavia is not a model.
No.
Tito sat on the thing, held it together. He goes and they divvy it up. It's messy, very messy. Lots of people get killed, but you've got stability. There is such a thing as Slovenia. There is such a thing as Croatia. That is simply not an option for Iraq.
I don't believe so, because I think, again, it would be a vacuum, as it was becoming before, into which the Saudis, the Iranian theocracy, and others would intervene.
All right. President Bush, once again, here's one of the rationales he puts forward for remaining in Iraq. Quote, "We fight for the possibility that decent men and women across the broader Middle East can realize their destiny and raise up societies based on freedom and justice and personal dignity," close quote. How do you respond to that?
Well, initially, after the liberation of Baghdad in the first place, liberation of Iraq in the first place, there were very positive responses from the people of Lebanon, for example, who voted in a majority to get rid of Syrian occupation and voted into power something like a multi-confessional democratic coalition. There's since been a terrible counterstroke to that from Hezbollah and its Syrian and Iranian backers. Nonetheless, it was an example worth having. Started a very lively argument about democratization and reform in Egypt, the crucial country in the region, and even in Saudi Arabia.
Egypt is crucial. Why? Because it's so big? 60 million people?
Yes. Someone once said, I forget who it was now, said that Egypt is the only real country in the Middle East, the only real nation. All the rest are just tribes with flags. It's an ancient, brilliant civilization. Right. Large population. It's the crossroads country.
The Lower Nile.
It's got real thickness and depth.
Got it. All right.
Now that discussion has been aborted about reform and democracy in Egypt, as has the one that started in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. But it did get started, and then there are actually rather surprisingly hopeful signs after the voluntary disarming of Libya, which had a lot to do with the removal of Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi's decision to get rid of his own weapons of mass destruction, and the consequent discussion, even though so far it only takes place between his sons and among his dynasty, about political reform and all of these things are very positive. But they're all coming up against very reactionary and cruel counter blows. But the president wasn't wrong to hope that by removing the worst dictator in the history of the region, that there could be an example set. But what we've underestimated, where have we not underestimated this, is the unbelievable ruthlessness and unbelievable barbarism of the forces of reaction in the area.
This is the final time I'll quote John Burns to you, because this seems to me to frame the polemical imperative. Can those who argue for a continued high level of American military involvement, read Christopher Hitchens, assure us that we wouldn't come to the same point of violence and civil war 3 or 4 years and perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 American soldiers killed later. If the answer is no, they can't, then that strengthens the arguments of those who say we might as well withdraw fairly quickly now. So we withdraw tomorrow, and there's a huge upsurge in violence. As you say, we would feel responsible for that, but the further along matters went, the greater removal from the matter in time, the less responsibility we would feel. And the question is, if that's going to happen if we withdraw tomorrow, what assurance can you give us that if we stay there for 3 or 4 years, the same thing wouldn't happen then?
Well, I know exactly what you mean. And I've been thinking this month about the British example in India. 60 years ago, they having stayed too long, they managed
They
also
then
to
got
pull
out
out
too
too
fast.
soon.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, you can get it all wrapped around the
all.
axle, and of course people are right to get impatient when they're told, well, you know, it's just if we stay there a bit longer, the long haul will anneal all this. And they say, well, how do you know that the bloodbath wouldn't happen whenever you left? In the case, you'd have to stay forever, or...
Right,
Well,
precisely. That's exactly the point.
I
think that gets at a real psychological...
I'd like to put these people's argument at its strongest, and I think I understand it. I repeat my 2 points. On the condition that we've inflicted a battlefield defeat on al-Qaeda and its allies, in other words, so not just crushed them in Iraq, but so discredited them, seen them discredited in front of the rest of the population. The major military and political and strategic goal, the smashing of al-Qaeda's forces in Iraq, coupled with the demonstration to the whole of the Arab world that an Iraqi population saw these guys up close and turned against them, wanted them thrown out. That's a huge thing. On that condition, we can say, well, after this, guys, you are on your own. We just said we were not going to have al-Qaeda inherit Saddam Hussein's mantle. And the second is that we will not allow the Kurdish Autonomous Zone, Kurdish regional government, to be subverted or invaded or undermined. That we will say that one of the great causes for pride for our intervention in the region is that we have allowed the freeing of the largest people in the world without a state of their own, and that...
How many Kurds are there? 50?
Well, it depends. In Iraq...
Right, that's the question, because they're in Iran as well, some in
Yes,
Turkey.
they're contiguous in where Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria meet.
Right.
Rough place to be a non-Arab people, or non-Turkish, non-Persian people, but they are variously measured, but they're by far the largest group of people in the world without a state of their own.
Right. Look, we leave Iraq across the seas and come here to the United States. What do you expect to happen when Petraeus testifies on Capitol Hill? I'm asking political questions now. You've just told us what we ought to do. If you were president, you would face a very serious political problem in that the climate in which General Petraeus will be testifying in just a couple of weeks now, polls indicate that the American people are overwhelmingly opposed to the war. The Democratic Party is solidly against the war. Every leader in Congress, every Democratic candidate for president wants out. On the Republican side, it seems to me that Rudy Giuliani and Mitt Romney want merely to avoid losing. You've only got one candidate who demonstrates a positive appetite for something like a victory. That's John McCain, who has seen his campaign implode and his standing in the polls fall to single digits. Into this, enter General David Petraeus. What happens?
Yes. Again, I have that same sense of tragedy and lack of synchronicity that I was mentioning with the British the other day. I mean, I saw General Petraeus in Mosul in 2003, and he was considered by even the most cynical journalists, reporters who were the most contemptuous of the American effort in Iraq, as an extraordinarily impressive warrior and officer.
Everyone responds to
yes,
this
he
man.
was withdrawn. They took him out. The thing was left to command of mediocrity really, for a very long time. We'll never know if that was the time when we lost him. If we only turned to him when it was too late. It's not possible to know these things in advance. What is possible, I think, to say there can be no discussion by any serious person of even the possibility of turning over a country like Iraq, a keystone state in the region and in the world economy, to the tender mercies of al-Qaeda. Not even one province of it, no. Now, the president doesn't seem to know how to make this point to his public. I don't know why. When he does, of course, he's tripped up by bogus casuistry. Arguments say, well, it's not really al-Qaeda, it's just another group calling itself al-Qaeda, as if, in fact, this group isn't even more venomous than bin Laden's and more bent on injury to us. So there's a shared responsibility perhaps there, but that's what does it for me. Instead, the president has decided to make the single stupidest analogy that it's possible to make, and the one that I've been spending 4 years trying to shoot down, and directly compared Iraq to, not just to Indochina, but to Vietnam, yes.
Well, if you read the text of the speech, what he talks about is the boat people. He talks about the collapse of Vietnam. And you've just said that, though, haven't you? That at least in that regard, the analogy is fair, that if we pulled out of Iraq, there would be a lot of deaths. Why was that a stupid thing to do?
Well, because the Vietnamese society was shattered. Indo-Chinese society had been shattered by a long and needless and aggressive American war, which was going to lead to mass death and exodus, no matter what happened. So that to say, well, we have to keep on doing it in case people get killed was an argument that weighed with nobody at all. The point,
your distinction
for
is
example, I think if the president was to say, I can't claim, Tom Friedman actually put it this way, addressing the so-called anti-war liberal and left, he said, if you think that the Iraqi so-called insurgents are the Viet Cong, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. He said, if they're anything, they're the Khmer Rouge. Now, how do you like your argument? That would weigh, because there were people like myself who wouldn't have been at all disconcerted to be told we were soft on the Viet Cong. But the Khmer Rouge is quite a different thing. And the standard set by the Khmer Rouge is one that is hotly emulated by the forces of bin Ladenism.
The Khmer Rouge slaughtered, as best one can tell, at least a third of the Cambodian population, their own people. Isn't that right?
Yes. The only reason some people don't want to call it genocide is it isn't clear whether you can commit genocide against your own people. But
right.
Yeah, it counts within any one of the annals of human self-destructiveness, cruelty, sadism, cultural desolation.
Final series of questions here. January 2009, a new president will take the oath of office. Can you envision any political circumstances, political scenario, give me what has to happen between now and then, for a new president to be able and willing to continue to fight that war as aggressively as necessary to achieve those two imperatives that you laid out for us? A devastating defeat on al-Qaeda and putting Kurdistan out of bounds.
It costs me a lot to say this, but the only person who's actually said either of those two things, not always in the same breath, but has said both at different times, is, or was until recently, Mrs. Clinton. Perhaps my least favorite person in public life, but because of her husband's administration's announced policy, which was, as you know, the removal of Saddam Hussein from office, because of, I think, some of the things she found out when she was in government, as she was in effect during that period, she's a prisoner of a certain amount of knowledge about the subject. Not the problem with most of her rivals for the nomination. But she seems to realize in the meantime that the auction to be the most anti-war is the only auction to be in, that she's thrown aside these very serious statements that she had made about how Saddam was in bed with al-Qaeda, which she was, about the importance of defending the Kurds, which she understands. These are not any longer themes in her conversation. Now it's all, I was anti-war before you were, and I was more than you were. It's puerile, it's pathetic to watch.
But at least there's a record in which she encountered reality and responded well to it.
She can be held to some serious statements she made on serious occasions. Yes.
On the Republican side, who's the least offensive, if that's the correct formulation?
The least offensive?
Least offensive. Whom would you, if you had to live under a Republican for the next 4 years, and your primary concern, which as I read it, it is Iraq, whom would you choose?
I'm a single-issue voter, all right. And for that reason, it would have to be, again, swallowing a huge number of misgivings. It would have to be Mr. Giuliani, because I don't believe Mr. McCain is up to it. I'm very sorry to have to say.
All right.
Either personally or politically, I simply don't think he could be or ought to be president. And though there are innumerable things about Rudy Giuliani that are very dismaying, on this point he seems to be
the strongest and the smartest?
Yes.
You give him both?
Yes.
All right. 4 years in Iraq.
With that expression on my face. All right. For those of you who aren't joining us on radio.
We go into Iraq March 20th, 2003. We sit here in the summer of 2007. What is the Bush administration's worst mistake and highest accomplishment? And what is Christopher Hitchens' worst mistake and highest accomplishment? Give me Bush first. We'll end with
I was going to do it in reverse order. If it was, well, if it was the Bush family's mistake, it was to not obviously I do insist, always insist on this, of not getting this done in 1991. That is, compared to all mistakes made since, and I know quite a lot about them, they're all dwarfed by that one. Then I think the mistake was to try to frighten people rather than educate them about the two very important questions of the nexus between weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Essentially, the president was right that Iraq was either latently or blatantly threatening in both those ways, but some corners were cut to scare people rather than educate them in this respect, I'm sorry to say. And then it was also represented to people that a victory would perhaps be somewhat easier and swifter than it would.
That wasn't misrepresented, though. They believed it themselves. Isn't
Oh
that
no!
the evidence
I don't think there was any bad faith in either of these cases. No, no.
All right.
But there's a certain amount of bravado, perhaps, and in one case, a willingness to go to the scare tactic rather than the painstaking explanation.
And the highest accomplishment?
The liberation of Kurdistan, the holding of elections. Now we almost forget these even
That these actually took place.
The attempt to draft an oil law that would provide the material basis for a federal democratic Iraq, because we've, as well as trying to draft the oil law, we've actually found deposits, large ones of oil, in Anbar and other Sunni areas, so that the old basis for dictatorship and sectarianism in Iraq, the uneven distribution of oil, could actually be overcome in real time. And we can say to the Iraqis, you can have civil war, you can have a civil war where we'd all lose, or you can have a civil war where only one group won, and there was another terrifying dictatorship and invasions of other countries or from other countries. But we will continue to hold up to you the option of a federal system
in which we can all be rich.
In which everyone can be rich, and because they have more oil possibly than Saudi Arabia there, and in which differences between you would be settled at the democratic level. Now, that is hugely to the credit of the United States. It's one of the noblest things it's ever done, is to continue patiently to say, you could try this as well.
Right, right.
And to defend and stand by those Iraqis, Kurdish and others and Arab who feel the same way.
Your own worst mistake over these 4 years?
I remember arguing with people in the administration before the intervention, saying, look, I hope we've got this clear. We're not going to let the Turks come into Kurdistan with us, which a lot of people thought was a price the administration would be willing to pay for a northern front. You know, not at that price. You won't pay that. People would say, no, don't worry about that. We're not going to let them. Even if they won't allow us the northern front, we're still not going to pay that price. Good. And we're not going to let General Sharon, I remember saying, because people were afraid of this too, take advantage of the confusion to do something stupid on the West Bank. No, the Israelis have been told none of that. All this. I'm not ashamed of that either. But I never said, by the way, I presume the Army Corps of Engineers knows how to get the lights turned on in Baghdad, doesn't it? And that's taken care of. We assume minimum competence on that level. I thought, I must say, I'm taking that for granted. That was a big mistake. It was a very big mistake. And that, there'll be enough guys to guard the museum. And stuff like that.
Assuming competence.
Nobody wants my advice on, General Hitchens' views on these things are not needful. Or Brigadier Hitchens, no, who cares? But on the political and moral question, on whether it's really going to be a regime change, we're not going to just decapitate the Saddam system and then try and rule by proxy through their army and their police. I knew that wasn't going to happen, but I didn't ask about the damn grid.
Invasion.
No.
All right. And
I thought we were can-do to that extent, I must say.
What action? What column that you've written? What action that you've taken has set the best example for your children during these last 4 years? What are you proudest of?
Trying to destroy the allure of religion.
Really?
Yes. And try to show people what happens when the parties of God get a free hand. Yeah. All right. Never, always holding up to people what happens when the faith-based have influence in politics. What evil and wickedness that is.
All right. Christopher Hitchens, thank you very much. Christopher Hitchens, the author of God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. See the show that we taped earlier today to see how religion might not poison everything. In any event, Christopher Hitchens, author of God is Not Great. Thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson.
Nice to have me.
This is Uncommon Knowledge. A pleasure, Christopher, as always.